Welcome to St. Norbert College Heritage Week. My name is Father Andrew Ciferni, St. Norbert College class of '64. I was the director of the Center for Norbertine Studies here from 2013 to 2018, and I'm now the chair of the Board of Trustees. I'm honored to have been asked to give this Heritage Week lecture, and the title I've given it is St. Augustine Goes to St. Norbert College. In the 5 years that I was here, I taught a course called Communio and the Norbertine Through the Centuries. It was in that register of Catholic imagination courses. In that course, one of the basic texts was the Rule of St. Augustine, who lived from the year 354 to 430. He wrote a little rule for his monasteries. It was taken up by St. Norbert and to this day is, after the Gospels, one of the most basic texts governing our Norbertine lives. It's always fascinating to have students read this rule and then discuss how it applies today, especially to how it might apply to common life in a residence hall. For example, issues of mutual correction, conflict, care for common spaces, and equipment. I once proposed the idea of shaping a workshop or some other format to present salient points of the rule as approaches to residence life in direct connection with the college's mission. As we anticipate the eventual hiring of a new vice president for student life, this material might spark some interest in taking up a conversation of different possibilities around this document that is at the core of Norbertine life. St. Augustine of Hippo was one of the greatest pastors, theologians, and monastic leaders in the Christian West. He was born in Tagaste, North Africa, now Algiers, in the year 354, and he died in the nearby city of Hippo in the year 430. His Confessions, reflections on his life, written after his conversion and baptism, figures in any great books program. My focus this evening is on the rule he wrote for religious communities, founded by him after his return to North Africa from Milan, around the year 387. Augustine put a high value on friendship, and he is never seen alone at any significant turn in his life. I'll start by this quotation from his Confessions. He's reflecting on the death of a close friend, and he does this reflection on friendship. What restored and recreated me above all was the consolation of other friends, in whose company I loved, what I was loving as a substitute for you. So Augustine is saying, as much as great as the love of friendship, the love of God is greater. There were other joys to be found in the company of friends, which still more powerfully captivated my mind. The charms of talking and laughing together, and kindly giving way to each other's wishes, reading elegantly written books together, sharing jokes and delighting to honor one another, disagreeing occasionally but without rancor, as a person might disagree with himself, and lending spice by that rare disagreement to our much more frequent accord. We would teach and learn from each other, sadly missing any who were absent, and blithely welcoming them when they returned. Such signs of friendship sprang from the hearts of friends who loved and knew their love returned, signs to be read in smiles, words, glances, and 1,000 gracious gestures. So were sparks kindled, and our minds were fused inseparably, out of many becoming one. I think that vision of friendship is, in fact, witnessed at St. Norbert College, but could be even more if in some way we took on the mentality of Augustine that we'll see in the rule. I'm not pretending in any way that a college campus, much less a residence hall, should be a monastery. So when I'm reading from the rule, it might seem a little strange. And what I'm going to ask you to do is try to listen beneath it. What's the principle that Augustine is working at? His rule is a handbook for ordering well the lives of men and women living in community on the model of the apostolic life of the Jerusalem community depicted in the opening chapters of the Acts of the Apostles, where they held all in common, where they shared their meals, where they were attentive to the concerns of one another. I like to speak of that life of the Jerusalem community as God's plan for all humanity. This evening, I want to propose some seed thoughts and questions on how the rule of Augustine might shape student life. I will select the most pertinent and practical texts from the rule, some of them will be long quotes, and attempt to make an application from them. It was a different context, it was a different world, but there are perennial virtues that contrasted his life in the monastery with the culture, as our life following the rule is also a contrast with the culture, and how even our lives as students, faculty, a community at St. Norbert College, in some way, buying into this rule can also be a contrast to the culture. So I'm going to start with chapter 2. Out of the gate, there's a very short beginning that I'll come to later. I think it makes more sense at the end. But after that very short beginning, right out of the gate, Augustine is not talking about prayer. He's talking about common ownership of property, which again, he looked to in the Jerusalem community. And here's the text. When those who own something in the world come to the monastery, let them place it willingly in common. But those who had nothing may not seek in the monastery what they could not have in the world. However, if their health demands it, they shall be given whatever they need, even though in the world their poverty was so great that they lacked even necessities. Let them not, however, consider themselves happy because they have found food and clothing which they could not find elsewhere. So we're going to see this very interesting tension in the rule, this emphasis on our common life, that what we hold equally, but yet how we are treated as individuals. So it's not a form of communism where everyone gets the same. It's that what is common is held in common, but it is distributed and used as according to the needs of individuals. Then he goes on with the virtue of humility. So he's talking again about these people who come from different classes. Let them not become proud because they associate with those they did not dare to approach in the world, but let them raise their hearts to heavenly things, not seeking the vanities of the world. Otherwise, our monasteries, our schools, will provide an advantage to the rich, but a hindrance to the poor, if the rich are humbled there and the poor become proud. So he's saying there's a problematic inversion. So the rich come in and share their wealth, and the poor are having wealth, possessing wealth for the first time, so that they can, that pride can be in the rich because of their virtue, but could also be in the poor because they now have access to what they never had access to before. He goes on to say, furthermore, those who held some position of honor in the world shall not look down upon the confreres who have come into this holy society from a life of poverty. Let them glory in their brotherhood, their sisterhood with the poor, rather than the dignity of their rich parents. Augustine wrote a version of this rule for men and for women. What we're seeing is that in Augustine's society, as in ours, there is a caste system. It was probably much more rigid in Augustine's time, that a person really could not move very well out of his socioeconomic caste. But Augustine is saying, in fact, in the monastery, we live outside of that caste system. We hold all in common. And so Augustine's world was one of radical social and economic inequality. Persons rarely rose above the caste into which they were born, but men and women across this spectrum were welcome on an equal basis into Augustine's communities. It seems to me there's an immediate application to be made here at St. Norbert College in our current efforts towards diversity, equality, and inclusion at the governance and administrative levels. But are there ways in which students from less privileged backgrounds are actively welcomed into the life of the community? That is something I think that is worthy of our exploration. He goes on to say, therefore let all live together in harmony and love, and in each other honor God whose temples you have become. So this is a place where Augustine's rule, which in many ways could be used by any group of people because of its virtues, it rarely becomes transcendent. But Augustine is saying that this possibility of people of different socioeconomic classes sharing and living together in harmony and love is possible only by seeing that we are reverencing the God who is in one another, the Christ who is in one another. So from there, on this humility, this equal common ownership of property, yet attention to the individual, now, after that, which he sees as critically important, now he moves into prayer. And he says, in the oratory, let no one do anything except that for which it was set apart, from which also it has its name. Therefore, if any of the confreres, even outside the hours appointed for prayer, wish to pray there during their free time, they should not be disturbed by others who think they have something else to do there. So it's the honoring of individual difference. It's against scorekeeping. The illustration that I use for this is how we don't disturb one another when we are realizing that, we are in a place of study or even a place of prayer or a place of quiet, that we respect the space of others. And that's what Augustine is saying, that when some of the members of the monastery were there in private prayer, they were not to be disturbed. And then he says, sing only what is appointed to be sung. Moreover, do not sing what is not prescribed to be sung. You have an illustration here of St. Norbert College football team, because I always gave this rule, as I said, as an assignment in the Communio course, and the students were asked to apply, to see how points of the rule could apply in their lives. And this was probably the most original, creative application that I heard, because I thought, how would somebody apply, sing only what is appointed to be sung? Moreover, do not sing what is prescribed to be sung. And one of the football players in the class said, you have to follow the play that the coach tells you to play. I thought, there we are. There is an application. So we are in situations where our individual freedom, which is of a very, very high priority in our culture, must be surrendered to the common good. We're going to see that again. For the sake of the common good, the individual freedom must be surrendered. Augustine then moves into food and abstinence. And again, he's going to be working on what expectations people have from the background they have. If those who are weak because of their former mode of life are given different food from the others, this should not offend the others, nor should this appear unjust to those whom a different upbringing has made stronger. So again, in this very strong communal life, Augustine is again making provision for individual needs. Individual needs, not individual wants. Neither should they consider those others more fortunate because they receive something which they themselves do not receive. So he's alerting us against scorekeeping. But rather, let them consider themselves fortunate in bearing privations which others cannot bear. So he's redefining happiness in the monastery, that as opposed to the unbridled lust for wealth, fame, and power that we see in the Jesus' temptation in the desert, Augustine, like Jesus, is redefining happiness, that there is a happiness in surrendering a good for the good of another. Individual need is always a concern within this common life. And he brings that down to the situation of the sick. Those who are sick must take, as those who are sick must take less food for fear of increasing their illness, so while recovering, they should receive what will quickly restore their strength, even if they were extremely poor in the world. Their recent illness gives them the same claim that the rich have from their former mode of life. So again, that those who came with less can claim more than those who came with more because of the common good. And because, again, Augustine is redefining happiness in the terms of his culture. So Augustine sees that perhaps this is not always going to be observed. And so he comes into what I would say in the monastery, both then and now from my own experience, is perhaps the most challenging part of the rule, and that is a fraternal correction, how we address one another in a way of concern for the good of the other. So Augustine says, if you notice in any confrere immodesty of the eye, so he was dealing with the whole question of how men or women are looking at others with lust. He's dealing with that in the previous chapter. So he's now talking about this, and if you notice in any confrere this immodesty of the eye of which I speak, admonish them at once, so the initial fault will not grow worse, but rather be corrected without delay. Again, Augustine is looking here at co-responsibility for the common good. So he says, but if after this warning you see him repeating the same offense on any other day, then whoever has discovered this must report him as one wounded and in need of healing. But first, the offense should be pointed out to 2 or 3, so that they may be convicted on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses and be corrected with due severity. So there is an obligation to confront, again, to point out that in this instance that Augustine is going to speak about, it's that the co-responsibility, which calls forth for fraternal or sororal concern, is about the common good. So he says, you must not think that you are uncharitable when you point out another's fault. On the contrary, you are not blameless if by your silence you permit your brothers or sisters to be lost when you might have corrected them by pointing out their offenses. For if your brother had a bodily wound which he wanted to hide because he feared the cure, would it not be cruel of you to keep silent and a kindness to make it known? How much greater then is your obligation to manifest his spiritual wound, lest he become more corrupt in his heart. So Augustine is accustomed to using medical metaphors. So he's saying, if in a situation which might be very clear to us right now with COVID, that we might need to point out the fact of someone having been exposed or perhaps even being in a social situation with a positive diagnosis. He's saying we wouldn't have much hesitation about revealing that to the authorities or to another, but yet we don't feel the same impulse to correct our moral faults of one another. So he's going on in this same vein, and he comes to this interesting part of the rule. When anyone has gone so far in misconduct as to have received letters secretly from anyone or any gifts whatsoever, if he confesses this of his own accord, pardon him and pray for him. So again, he's asking that what we have received be shared. So I can remember as a student, you would get a box of cookies or some goods from home, and there was, especially in that setting of a residence hall, that willingness to share, which is a part of the affection that draws us together. He then goes on to talk about the care that we have for what we hold in common. So he says, and this is, I think, is at the heart of the rule. So he's talking about, it's in this chapter on the care for our common goods and equipment, etc. And he says, "No one shall do anything for himself alone, but all your work shall be for the community, done with more constant diligence than if each one worked for his own profit. For charity, of which it is written that it is not self-seeking, is to be understood thus: it prefers the common good to the interests of the individual, not personal interest to the common good. And therefore, the more you care for the interests of the community before your own interests, the more you may know that you have made progress. Thus, every passing need will be topped by love, which lasts forever." So I've given the very clear visual illustration of walking in, say, for example, to a suite in Greece hall and seeing the sink filled with dishes from people who have eaten different meals at different times. And maybe the first person said, well, those aren't my dishes, but then added their own. So there is not this concern for the common health and good of the community, so that we're living just from our individual laziness or our individual lack of care. So this is at the heart, I think, of applying the rule of Augustine to college life or to any life, for preparing ourselves for our vocations and careers. It may be the most culturally challenging piece of the rule in a society where the priority is given to individual freedom and anything and can be manifest in any and everything, from the rise in civil suits in court to some expression of protest or cancel culture. At the college level, it is expressed in care for lab and sports equipment shared with others, in establishing and respecting roles and tasks in residence halls and houses. So he moves there from, again, he's going to move back to gifts. So these things, that sports equipment, lab equipment, books, we have a common responsibility. But he comes back again that if anyone brings gifts regarded as necessary to his children or to others in some way connected to him, these gifts must not be received secretly, but shall be under the authority of the superior, so that placed in the common store, they may be given to those who need them. Now, obviously, that is not a rule that can be enforced in a residence hall or in life at St. Norbert College, but it is Augustine's spirit of our being willing to share what we have with one another. He comes back again to this question of, he's using the medical metaphor again, of if a servant of God is afflicted with some hidden ailment, whatever he says about his affliction should be believed without hesitation. But if it is not certain that the remedy he desires would be good for him, let a doctor be consulted. So again, he's coming to this point of, for the common good, it may be necessary for us to say that a person has a medical condition which is harmful for him or her, or even for those with whom they're sharing life. The care of the sick, whether during their convalescence or when suffering from some weakness without any sign of fever, shall be entrusted to someone who can secure whatever they see that patient needs, that care we have for one another. Those who are placed in charge of pantry or clothing, we would say of sports equipment or lab equipment, should serve their confreres without grumbling. So that sense of the common good. On the other hand, those in charge of clothing and shoes should give these things out promptly to those who need them. Not a very applicable part of the rule, but again, the general virtue under it is that the more we care for the interests of the community before our own interests, the more we may know that we have made progress, and that we have made progress in our love for one another, which lasts forever. Obviously, people fail in this, and so Augustine deals with seeking pardon and forgiving offenses. He says, either do not have quarrels, or if they begin, put a stop to them at once, lest anger grow into hatred and make it beam out of a splinter and make the soul a murderer. For thus you read, everyone who hates his brother is a murderer. So it's the effect of even our thoughts upon the person that we are cooperating with God to create. If anyone has injured another by insulting, abusive, or even incriminating language, let him remember to make satisfaction as soon as he can for the wrong he has done, and he who has been injured must forgive without further controversy. And if both have injured each other, they must mutually forgive their trespasses for the sake of your prayer, which should be more sincere the more frequently you repeat them. So again, he's coming to a transcendent reason. Why would we forgive? Well, we could say from a psychological point of view that to hold on to hatred, to not forgive, is to keep ourselves trapped within ourselves. People have said, that when we refuse to forgive, we're drinking poison and thinking the other person will die. It's that the lack of forgiveness keeps us trapped. And so he says, and if you have both injured each other, you must mutually forgive your trespasses for the sake of your prayer. So he's saying your prayer is infected by that lack of forgiveness. And then he says this interesting psychological insight. The person who is frequently tempted to anger, yet who hastens to beg forgiveness of the one injured, is better than the one who is more slow to anger, but is too slow to beg forgiveness. The one who never wishes to beg forgiveness or does not do it from the heart does not belong in the community, even though not put out. Be sparing, therefore, in the use of harsh words. If they have escaped your lips, let those same lips be prompt to heal the wounds they have made. And finally, Augustine is coming towards the end of the rule, and he is speaking about authority. So again, here, Augustine has a concern for individual need, and so for a certain amount of individual freedom, but that is tempered for the common good. And in his situation, that is tempered by the superior. And I think we could apply that to the way teaching works. So their teaching is a way, it is a discipline from the word discipulus, a student. And so Augustine is asking for obedience. We would say the Latin virtue of pietas, reverence, respect for those in authority. It shall be the principal duty of the superior, of the faculty member of administration, to see that this sense of this rule is observed, and that this kind of life should restrain the restless, comfort the discouraged, support the weak with patience towards all. Augustine suggests that the rule be read once a week so that it is a mirror. So one of the books on the rule is called Like a Mirror, that we hold up this mirror and see how the image or the image that we see is corresponding to the image in the rule. So I want to come at the end to the beginning, because I began with chapter 2. The very beginning of the rule is this: Let us love God above all things, dearest brothers and sisters, then our neighbor, for these are the chief commandments given to us. Augustine is sometimes called the apostle of love, because um, love inflamed his life. So that original image, he often seen with a flaming heart. That it is love that makes this kind of life possible. And then in the very first chapter, it's very short, he says, "These are the precepts which we order you who live in the monastery to observe." So those excerpts that I've been reading. Then he says, "The first purpose for which you have come together is to live in unity and to be of one mind and one heart on the way to God." So I'm looking at the beginning at the end, so that you might think of all these very practical, sometimes to many of us in the 21st century, quite strange precepts. But again, we're always looking at the virtue under the precept, that the precept is to maintain this common life, this communio, but always to have attention to the needs of the individual. And Augustine says that in this life together, we are to be of one mind and one heart. He takes that from the Acts of the Apostles, where it says they were of one mind and one heart. But Augustine adds a phrase to it. He says, "one mind and heart on the way to God." In Latin, it's in with the accusative. It indicates movement toward. So that this whole life, practical as it is, about taking care of equipment, attending to the care of a space, attending to the, the, the virtue and the health of one another, all of this is part of the journey into God. And it's being the journey into God, being attentive to that, is really what inspires it and makes it possible. So we look at the end of this presentation at the beginning of the rule which is a practical, almost non-religious rule whose goal is communio with God and with one another. Thank you.